when that movie came out. Was anything cut from that film?
The studio actually legally couldn't trim it. They couldn't cut anything.
There are movies that entertain you, and then there are movies that permanently rewire how you think about film. Blazing Saddles, released in February 1974, belongs firmly in the second category. Mel Brooks created something so chaotic, so deliberately offensive, and so shockingly brilliant that Hollywood has spent the last 50 years trying to figure out exactly what happened. Critics have dissected it. Film schools have studied it. Comedians have stolen from it. And yet, hiding inside one of the most analyzed comedies ever made, there is a blooper so brazen, so wonderfully strange, that it slipped past audiences for decades. Not a flubbed line. Not a continuity error. Something far more interesting. Something that tells you everything about how this movie got made, and why it still matters today. But to understand the blooper, you first have to understand the battlefield it was born on. America in 1974 was not a comfortable place. The Vietnam War had ended in humiliation. The Watergate scandal had exposed the President of the United States as a criminal, and Richard Nixon was weeks away from becoming the first American president to resign from office. Trust in institutions was at a historic low. The country was angry, embarrassed, and desperately looking for something to laugh at. Hollywood, meanwhile, was still operating on old myths. The Western genre, in particular, had spent decades presenting a version of American history that was clean, heroic, and almost exclusively white. Cowboys were noble. Outlaws were punished. The frontier was a place where hard work and toughness won the day. The genre had no interest in examining what the American West actually looked like, who actually lived there, or whose land was actually being taken. Mel Brooks looked at all of this and saw an opportunity. Not just to make a funny movie, but to make a film that used comedy as a sledgehammer against mythology. He wanted to demolish the Western, not gently parody it, but burn it down and sift through the ashes while making the audience laugh so hard they couldn't catch their breath. The premise he developed with his writing team, which included the legendary comedian Richard Pryor, was almost absurdly simple. A corrupt politician appoints a black sheriff to a racist white town, expecting the townspeople to drive themselves out in protest. Instead, the new sheriff, a man named Bart, turns out to be smarter, sharper, and more capable than anyone around him. The racism that was supposed to destroy him becomes the very thing he turns back on the people wielding it. Richard Pryor had been the first choice to play Bart. His writing fingerprints are all over the script, in the sharpness of the dialogue, in the way the film refuses to soften its racial commentary, in the willingness to make the audience genuinely uncomfortable before making them laugh. But Warner Brothers refused to insure him due to his well-documented personal struggles, and the role went to Cleavon Little, a Broadway-trained actor who brought something unexpected to the part, an almost preternatural coolness. Where Pryor might have played Bart with electricity and fire, Little played him like a man who had already won the argument and was simply waiting for everyone else to figure it out. The result was a film that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Slapstick for those who wanted pure comedy. Biting satire for those paying closer attention. And underneath it all, a genuine, angry statement about how American culture processed, performed, and perpetuated racism. All of this was already enough to make Blazing Saddles remarkable. But then there is the blooper. The climax of Blazing Saddles is one of the most deliberately unhinged sequences in Hollywood history. The final battle between the heroes and the villain's army begins in the fictional town of Rock Ridge, which is exactly what you would expect from a Western. But then, without warning or apology, the action crashes through the literal walls of the Warner Brothers studio and spills out onto real Hollywood sound stages. Characters from the Western suddenly find themselves fighting through the set of an entirely different musical production. The chaos multiplies. People are brawling in corridors, on studio lots, across Hollywood Boulevard itself. The movie essentially eats itself alive, and the audience is left laughing at the spectacle of a film collapsing in real time. Brooks had planned the sequence carefully. The entire breakdown of the fourth wall was intentional, designed to underline the satirical point the movie had been making all along, that what you are watching is a constructed fiction, that the Western myth was always a performance, and that the performance has now run completely out of control. But here is what was not planned. As the cast pours out through the studio gates and into the street, moving in the frantic, absurd energy of the scene, a man walks calmly through the shot. He is not in costume. He is wearing ordinary street clothes, a sweater, completely unbothered, moving at the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and has no particular interest in the film crew around him. He appears to have simply been walking past the studio at the exact moment the cameras were rolling and strolled directly through the middle of cinematic history. He is a real, live, genuine stranger. Not an extra. Not a planted audience member. Not a piece of scripted business. A man who, through no intention of his own, became part of one of the most celebrated comedies of the 20th century. When it was pointed out to Mel Brooks, he had a choice. He could cut the shot. He could try to obscure the man through editing. He could reshoot the sequence. He did none of these things. Instead, according to multiple accounts from the production, Brooks looked at the footage and said something to the effect of, "Leave it in. It works." And here is the thing. He was right. The random man in the sweater, walking calmly through the apocalyptic finale of a film about the collapse of American mythology, is somehow the perfect final note. The whole movie had been arguing that reality and fiction were absurdly entangled, that the stories we tell about ourselves are both ridiculous and consequential. And then, right at the end, an actual real person wanders in from actual real life and proves the point without saying a single word. It is the best blooper in Hollywood history. And for decades, most audiences had no idea it was there. The stranger in the sweater was not the only accident that made Blazing Saddles great. The entire film was built on a foundation of controlled chaos, and Brooks had a gift for recognizing when an unplanned moment was better than anything written in the script. The campfire flatulence scene, which has become one of the most iconic moments in comedy film history, is a perfect example. Before Blazing Saddles, no major Hollywood production had ever included audible flatulence as a joke. The sound simply did not exist in mainstream cinema. Cowboys, in the world of Hollywood westerns, did not fart. They were mythic figures. They ate beans around campfires and remained heroic and odorless. Brooks wanted to destroy that image completely. He included the scene deliberately, over the loud and repeated objections of Warner Brothers executives who found it vulgar and embarrassing. But he did not stop there. After reviewing the initial cut, he went back into post-production and added more flatulent sounds, because test audiences had been laughing so hard at the beginning of the gag that they were missing the punchlines at the end. The scene had to be extended to accommodate how much people were laughing. This is the paradox of Blazing Saddles. A film that looks like pure anarchic madness was actually the product of very careful, very deliberate decisions about when to push further and when to pull back. Brooks knew exactly what he was doing with the campfire scene. He was not being vulgar for its own sake. He was systematically dismantling the noble cowboy myth, one fart at a time. The same deliberateness shows up in the Yiddish-speaking Native Americans. In an early sequence, young Bart and his family encounter a group of warriors on horseback, and what comes out of the tribal chief's mouth is not any indigenous language. It is fluent Yiddish. The chief, played by Brooks himself, delivers full sentences in a Jewish dialect. Other warriors respond in kind. The joke works on two levels. On the surface, it is surreal and unexpected, and the surprise alone generates the laugh. But underneath that, Brooks was making a pointed observation about how Hollywood had historically treated indigenous people in westerns. They were always the threatening other, the foreign enemy, rarely humanized, almost never given authentic language or culture. By replacing that absence with Yiddish, of all things, Brooks was calling attention to how shallow and interchangeable Hollywood's portrayal of the other had always been. It was absurdist commentary dressed up as a punchline. Then there is the opening theme, performed with complete sincerity by country and western singer Frankie Laine. His voice is powerful, emotional, and totally committed. He sounds like he is singing the theme to a genuine Hollywood epic. What Brooks neglected to tell him was that the film was a comedy. Laine had no idea. He sang every note with full dramatic conviction, and the result is perfectly, exquisitely ironic. The gap between the seriousness of the performance and the absurdity of what follows is itself a joke, one that plays out before a single frame of the actual film appears. When Warner Brothers sat through the first complete screening of Blazing Saddles, the room was reportedly silent. Executives did not laugh. One called it career-ending. Another described it as too vulgar for American audiences. Ted Ashley, who was running the studio at the time, reportedly wanted to release it in only a handful of cities, let it die quietly, and move on. What saved the film was something the studio had apparently not considered when they signed the contract. Mel Brooks had final cut authority. Legally, Warner Brothers could not alter, edit, or censor the film without his permission. Every objectionable scene, every fart sound, every use of language that made executives wince, all of it was protected. Brooks had negotiated that protection precisely because he knew what was coming. The limited release opened to immediate and overwhelming popular enthusiasm. Audiences were not offended. They were liberated. They were laughing at things they had never been allowed to see laughed at before. Theaters extended their runs. Word of mouth spread the way only genuinely exciting things spread. Warner Brothers, realizing catastrophically late that they had misread the entire situation, scrambled to expand distribution nationally. By the end of its theatrical run, Blazing Saddles had earned over $100 million. The film that the studio wanted to bury became one of the highest-grossing comedies of the decade. So what does it mean that the most enduring accidental moment in Blazing Saddles is a random stranger walking through the frame? It means something important about the film's relationship with reality. Blazing Saddles was never content to stay inside its own fictional world. The whole movie is constantly reaching outward, pointing at the camera, acknowledging the audience, breaking through walls both literal and figurative. It was always trying to close the gap between the film and the real world it was commenting on. When that unplanned stranger wandered through the final shot, he completed something the film had been building toward all along. Here was a real person, from real life, walking through the constructed fiction of a Hollywood movie. He was not aware he was making a point about the nature of cinema and American mythology. He was just trying to get somewhere. And yet his accidental presence said something that all the scripted dialogue in the world could not have said as cleanly. Mel Brooks recognized it immediately, which is why he left it in. That instinct, the ability to see an accident and understand that it is better than anything you planned, is exactly what made Blazing Saddles the film it became. Not perfect. Not polished. Not safe. But alive in a way that most movies never manage to be. The campfire scene made executives uncomfortable. The stranger in the sweater made history. And somewhere in that gap between discomfort and history is the reason Blazing Saddles is still worth talking about 50 years later. Some movies are